Hello, I'm John. Welcome back. So today I'm going to do a little bit of a reading update. I've been reading quite a few books over the last couple of weeks. I had hoped to do these videos more often because when I do them so far apart like this, I rack up quite a few books and then it's really hard to talk about them. It's kind of frustrating sometimes. I don't always know what to say about books, but I have 6 books that I've finished and a couple of books that I'm working on at the moment, but I wanted to share them with you. And I don't know how in depth I'm going to go about them. I have already talked about one in a separate video. Not many people have watched that video, unfortunately. I liked that video. I had a good time making that video. I'll talk about that in a minute. So anyway, the first book I read was The Dead Path by Stephen M. Irwin. Stephen M. Irwin is an Australian author. He's written 9 books, I believe. This is the only one I've seen. I've had this book on my shelf for almost 13 years. I've tried to read it several times and never really could get into it. I've never made it past the first 5 pages. But the other day I needed a book to read, and I thought, you know what, I'll give it a chance. It was a rainy day, and I just latched onto it, and I read this book in 2 days. I really enjoyed it. And that gave me some interesting thoughts about why is it that sometimes we buy books and then we're not interested in them for a long period of time, and then one day they're just the right books to read, and we wonder why we've never read them. So anyway, in the very first part of this book, the very first 5 pages, so Nicholas Close is from Australia, and he's moved to London. He's been in London for about 17 years, and he goes around collecting antiques, buying antiques from people to put in commercial businesses. That's what he does. He's married to a woman named Kate. They buy an apartment, and she is sanding the ceiling in the bathroom and runs out of sandpaper. I think she has just a little bit left, and she sends Nicholas out to get some more sandpaper from the hardware store. It's raining, but he can't get his car out from where it's parked, so he takes his motorcycle, and he sees a scary face over in the bushes and wrecks his motorcycle. And in his dazed situation, he calls his wife on the phone, and she tries to get down off the ladder, trips, falls, breaks her neck, and dies. And so he goes into mourning, of course. I mean, he feels terrible. But he doesn't really understand what's happened. It doesn't make sense to him in his mind how these things happened. But anyway, the apartment gets cleaned out. He can't stand to go back in there, and he's going to sell it. He goes back to get his things, which have been put in boxes, and he trips on the stairs and smacks his head on the concrete step. And from that moment on, he can see ghosts. Everywhere he goes, he can see ghosts. So he can't do his job anymore because he has to go into attics and barns and basements, and everywhere he goes, he sees the last 30 seconds, the last minute of these people's lives everywhere he goes, and they can see him. And he also sees his wife's ghost. So he goes back to Australia to live with his mom. His mom's not happy to see him. And when he gets back, he learns that there is a series of child murders going on. Every few years, there will be a murder of a child. They'll have their throat cut by someone who seemingly has no motive to do this, no inclination to do this, like they just snapped and went and did it. And this brings us back to Nicholas's childhood, where we learn that when he was a kid, he had gone with his friend to the woods, and there was something that he wanted to show his friend, and it turns out to be a witch's bait. Basically, there's a witch, and the witch is luring these kids into the woods. And his friend touches this lure, this bait, and a man comes up in a car, comes over, chases them into the woods, and kills his friend. And now he's, all grown up, and he's seeing this happening again, and he wants to try to do something about it. And on top of that, when he goes to the woods, he can see the ghosts of these other kids who have vanished and been killed. And so he goes about finding out who the witch is, and he has an idea of who it was. And gradually his sister and a priest, he finds a priest to talk to, and they go about trying to get rid of this witch. And the witch, of course, notices that they're back, or notices that Nicholas is back, because the trap had originally been laid for Nicholas. She wanted Nicholas, but not to kill him. And I guess I won't go too far into the story, but it becomes a battle between the people trying to get rid of the witch and her familiar, which is a giant spider. There are a lot of spiders in this book. And so there are some flaws. The whole seeing ghosts thing kind of doesn't work in the story. It does and it doesn't. It's a little... I expected more out of that. Now, if you're familiar with like B movies, horror movies, there is a thing in B movies where they do this circular ending sort of thing. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. That was present in this book. I didn't like that. I don't like that in books. I don't particularly like that in movies. But anyway, I thought it was pretty good. I thought that the descriptions of the settings and the dialogue was really good for a first novel. There were some, like I said, there were some storylines that didn't go anywhere. There were some ways I'd like the plot to have been tightened up a little bit, but it was enjoyable. And that is The Dead Path by Stephen M. Irwin. I'd gladly read other books by Stephen M. Irwin. And the next book I read was Killers of the Seas by Edward R. Ricciuti. This is from 1972. I think this version, this edition is from 1973. Okay, no, I was wrong. So this is from 1973. This edition is from 1975. And I just really enjoyed this. This was really good. It's a very casual sort of, I guess, zoology or something like that. I'm not sure what the proper term is. But it just goes through all kinds of dangerous fish, sea mammals, sharks, that kind of thing. Now, me personally, I'm not that interested in sharks. I know loads of people are. I just never have been. I'm really interested in the other creatures in this book. Now, the sharks that I am interested in are pretty much harmless, mostly, like the whale shark and the basking shark. I find them very interesting. The goblin shark is really interesting to me, and the Greenland shark. But, sharks in general, great whites, tiger sharks, bull sharks, they just don't really do much for me. I think they're interesting, but they just, they don't really capture my interest. But all these other creatures do. All these, let's just see here some of the creatures in this. Some of them are from rivers and lakes. So you have the kangaroo, and if you know what the kangaroo is, you're probably crossing your legs. A tiny vampire catfish that embeds itself inside the human host, causing an agonizing death. And some of the others are the Arctic jellyfish, which is 8 feet across and tentacles that trail for a distance of 200 feet. The blue-ringed octopus, the giant squid, the puffer fish, the sea wasp, a fragile jellyfish, the most dangerous inhabitant of the deep. Death comes only seconds after its tentacles touch human flesh. So from the back of that book, you might think this is sensationalist, but it's really not. It's just a really casual description of some of these animals. I don't know if I can show you many of the pictures because this book's kind of fragile. There's a grouper. And unfortunately, there are a lot of pictures of, dead fish and things like that. So it's an older book, and you have to deal with some of the things like that. But there's a section on orcas, a section on whales, there's a section on seals and sea lions, and there's even a section on sea monsters. And he comes out and says, there's no evidence for sea monsters, but wouldn't it be neat if there were sea monsters? So he talks about some of the things people have claimed to see, and some of the things that have been found in the ocean, which are quite weird, that no one has been able to explain. And now I'm sure some of these mysteries have been solved in the last 50 years, but I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. I don't read a lot of books about animals, so I didn't know if I would enjoy this or not. I really did. So that's Killers of the Seas by Edward R. Ricciuti. And after that, I read Shiloh and Other Stories by Bobbie Ann Mason. And there's Bobbie Ann Mason. And I really, really enjoyed this. This is about regular people in Western Kentucky in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, I said this in my video about this book, but this is perhaps the first time I've ever picked up a literary work and seriously and immediately connected with the people and places and their conversations and their problems in their lives. And that was just really, it's hard to explain the feeling I got from that, because it's never really happened to me before, not with literary fiction. Most literary fiction takes place in high society, with wealthy people, very well-educated people in, Los Angeles, New York, Boston, London, Paris, etc., etc. And I mean, I can empathize with those characters as fellow human beings, but I don't always understand the course of their lives. I don't always understand the issues they're dealing with in their lives. So this was a first for me, really, to pick up a book. I mean, it's a collection of short stories, but I just felt like I knew the people she was talking about. I felt like I had had the conversation she was writing about in some cases. And, she talks about the World War II generation. She talks about the Vietnam hippie generation and the generation coming up in the 80s. And I've known people from all those generations. So, yeah, it was just a really interesting thing for me to feel that kind of resonance with a literary work. I really didn't expect it, and I really enjoyed it. So that is Shiloh and Other Stories by Bobbie Ann Mason. I made a video about this. It's about 20 minutes long, but it was a good book. I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed making that video also. So the next book I finished was Compulsory Games by Robert Aickman. This is a collection of short stories. They are strange stories. They are weird stories. And I don't think that they're Aickman's best by far. This kind of seems like, and in the introduction, who wrote the introduction here? Victoria Nelson. She describes how some of these stories were never published, and they are kind of, now all of Aickman's stories are weird, and they are ambiguous, and you're not going to know what happened or why it happened in most cases. You are left guessing, and that was on purpose. And I have to say that as I was reading this, there were some stories that I really liked, and there were some that I didn't like and I didn't understand. Most of them have to do with marriage and relationships and that kind of thing. There were stories about, one of the common themes in his stories, in this book at least, is that he'll talk to men who are in, or not talk to, I'm sorry, he'll write about men who are in these bureaucratic positions, these low-level or mid-level bureaucratic positions, And they have this problem where they can't really tell faces apart. Like, they can't tell people apart. And, so they're detached from their worlds, but I felt like that detached us from the character also, because, I mean, we have this character that can't tell the difference between the people that they're around. And they're very bland characters most of the time. They live very bland lives, and that the weirdness comes into their bland lives. But we're not always, like I said, we're not given really any information whatsoever on what's going on. There was one story about a man who, now these are the ones that I liked best. There's a story about a man who lives with his wife in a house, and around the corner is a lady who is a mid-level bureaucrat in the council. And she's older, and his wife has to go to India for some reason for about a week. And while she's gone, the lady invites him over to her house and basically makes a pass at him, which he refuses. And after that, she steals his wife, and they become lovers. And his wife, she and his wife become pilots. They go to, they go to flying school and become pilots, and they buy their own plane. And his wife just gradually gets further and further away from him and moves in with her, and then they vanish. And the man doesn't really do anything about it. Like, he's bothered by it, but he doesn't speak up or anything. That's a common theme in Aickman stories, is that people don't speak up. They don't speak up ever. They just let things kind of happen. And so the man becomes convinced all the time. He hears this airplane flying around. Everywhere he goes all day long, he hears this airplane. And we're not really certain if it's there or not. And by the end of the story, we realize that it's probably not there. And he goes way north into Scotland, I think, and he still hears the airplane there. And at the end, we're left not knowing whether he has been killed or not by this airplane. And I will be honest and say that's one of the very few that I actually remember from this conversation, from this collection. There was another one where a man is living in a house, and he shows up from work early one day, and he hasn't been living there very long. And behind some bushes, he sees that there is some water, kind of like a river, and he never noticed this river before. And there's a boat out back. There's like a little dock, and he goes down to the dock, and there's a boat, and he gets on the boat and floats around, and he sees a man on the far bank going like this, "Hey man," waving at him. So he paddles over there to see what the guy wants. And now the guy is kind of like a magical figure. Like, he is a well-known magician, like not a stage magician, but a magic practitioner who claims he can do all these things, and who has a following, like a cult following. Kind of like a sorcerer, I guess. And we go along with him on this dreamlike conversation into this house that's bigger on the inside than the outside. And the guy has, he'll just open his hand and have fruit in his hand or this and that. And he gives him some liquor that's messes him up. And it's called No Time Is Passing. And so some weird things happen to him. He falls asleep in this house. And when he goes back, it seems like a lot of time has passed. Like, his wife was pregnant when he went across the shore. Now apparently their child is like a year old. His wife is wearing a dress he's never seen. So, just weird things like that. And that's how Robert Aickman's stories are. They're ambiguous. We're not really told what's happening. And I have to be honest and say that when you have stories where they're very ambiguous and the character doesn't seem to care, I have a hard time caring about what's going on, because if I don't understand what's going on and the character doesn't seem bothered by it, I don't really understand why I should be bothered by it. And that made this hard to read for me because I just didn't feel any real sense of involvement in the stories. Now, apparently Aickman found his stories really, really funny, kind of like Kafka found his own stories really funny. But I have to say that the humor must be so different that I just didn't see it. Yeah, so that is Compulsory Games and my likely unsatisfying explanation of it. Now, the book I tried to read after that, and I didn't read it, is Young Men in Fire by Norman MacLean. And it just wasn't a good time for me to read this. It's a manuscript that was found after Norman MacLean had died, and it wasn't finished. And so it's got a lot of flaws in it. Somebody did edit it and tried to make it into a completed work, and it just wasn't really completed. And so it's a little bit repetitive and just a little bit rough. And so some of his allusions are a little rough. Some of his attempts at making the book more poetic are a little bit rough. It's an uncompleted manuscript, an incomplete manuscript. It's not edited. It's not finished. So I wanted to come back to this at some other time. I liked what I read. This is about a fire in a national park or just a forest in 1949, and these smoke jumpers who jumped down to put this fire out, or to attempt to, not to put it out, but to attempt to control it, and they were killed in a blow up. And that should be really good. I've read another book about smoke jumpers. I think it was by Sebastian Junger. I think it was called Fire. I'm not 100% on that. It was really good, so I thought this would be pretty good. I still think this will be pretty good. I do want to read this. I just want to read it at some other time when I have more of an ability to focus on it, to kind of overlook the flaws. And the next book I read was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Holmes by John H. Watson, M.D., as edited by Loren D. Estelman. So I've read the other book by Loren Estelman that was a Sherlock Holmes book, or I've read another book. I don't know if it was his only one, if he wrote just two, or if he wrote more. I hope he wrote more. The other book was Sherlock Holmes versus Dracula. I think it was called Or the Adventures of the Sanguinary Count. And that was okay. I'll be completely honest and say I didn't understand why Dracula didn't just do away with Sherlock Holmes. I mean, there was nothing to stop him. So I didn't really like that book very much. I mean, I enjoyed reading it, but it had, I kept thinking of that, like, why is Dracula letting this guy hound him like this? And that was never really answered. But in this book, so this is, clearly Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with Sherlock Holmes tacked onto it. And I have read Jekyll and Hyde probably about 10 years ago. And so this is the real story about what happened and how Robert Louis Stevenson came to write Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and why he left out Sherlock Holmes and Watson. And it was really good. I really did like it. I mean, I don't really know how I can explain it to you really well. I mean, it is exactly what you think it would be. It is Holmes and Watson trying to figure out how Dr. Jekyll is, how he is linked to Mr. Hyde. And it has some really good scenes, like there's a scene where Watson sees, now at this point, Mr. Hyde has already killed the person he kills, whose name is slipping out of my mind at this point, but Mr. Hyde kills somebody, and then he's wanted all over London, all over. And as Watson comes out of a place, he sees Mr. Hyde in a carriage, and he stops the next carriage he sees and says, "After that carriage," and there's like basically it's a car chase scene, but in horse-drawn carriages through London, and that was really fun. So yeah, it was just fun, and it was really interesting. I mean, seeing Holmes come to the conclusion that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. It was just fun. It was just very enjoyable. I really liked it. And I read this as part of Holmes is Where the Heart Is. And I think that was created by Jim at Mystery and Mayhem. And I wanted to read some Holmes fiction, some pastiche for Holmes is Where the Heart Is. But I really didn't find myself drawn to any other pastiche fiction that I have right now. And so I read this and I really enjoyed it. And the last book that I read in this period of time is Not That You Asked by Andrew A. Rooney, who didn't like being called Andy, but was called Andy by everybody, and didn't like being called Andrew either, which leads you to think, what the hell am I supposed to call you? But anyway, so this was like his other books. I've read 5 of his books like this, and this is all his columns. He wrote columns for newspapers, and some of these may be his segment on 60 Minutes. They're not differentiated from, so I don't know which is which. But now, Rooney came out of that World War II generation, so he has some pretty old-fashioned ideas sometimes. He has some pretty rude ideas sometimes. He wasn't afraid to be rude. He wasn't afraid to go against what was popular or polite or politically correct. It got him in hot water sometimes. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these got him in hot water. This is the first one that ever really got on my nerves. I don't know why that is. I don't know if maybe I just have a bit of an overload because I've read 5 or 6 of his books in the last 2 years. And they all follow the same kind of, they are newspaper columns, so they're supposed to be short and potent, right? They're supposed to get to the point in a hurry. And maybe when you read all of them at once in a very short period of time, I read this in, I think, 2 or 3 days, it just gets a little bit overwhelming, to know that he was he may not have been very, really rich or anything, but he was very well paid for his position. So sometimes when you hear somebody who's very well paid complaining about not wanting to pay an extra 15 cents for socks or something like that, it gets a little bit old, where he's talking about his vacation house, but then he's complaining about the price of a stamp or something. It gets a little bit rough. And hearing him complain about how people would come up to him and say, "Hey, aren't you Andy Rooney?" I mean, he chose to be on the television. He chose to be on the television. He didn't have to do it. Nobody forced him to do it. He made that decision himself, and he had to live with the consequences. One of the consequences of being a public figure is that sometimes people are going to come up to you and say, "Hey, aren't you that guy?" And instead of being polite about it, Rooney would be rude about it. And personally, I think that says something about him. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I don't buy it. I don't really buy that claim of his that he says, "Why would people come up to me and talk to me? I want to be known as a writer. And, I don't understand why people think they have the right to come up and talk to me just because I'm on television." And it's like, well, people come up and they talk to Charles Kuralt, and they come up and they talk to Walter Cronkite, and Walter Cronkite is polite, so why don't you just be polite or quit your show, one of the two? I mean, I don't know, I'm just ranting about Andy Rooney, but I think I've just had too much Andy Rooney in the last 2 years, and I may have to lay off his books for quite a while. I like some of them because it is good to hear. Sometimes it's good to hear somebody complain about things that are irritating, but I think sometimes Rooney would take it too far and complain about things that really weren't a big deal to anybody but him. I mean, I realize that's part of the draw of having a newspaper column like that or having a segment like that on 60 Minutes. But I've just been overloaded on it. That's all. I've just been overloaded on it. So now we come to the books that I've been reading and that I hope to read. And the one I'm mainly focusing on is Bring Out Your Dead by J.H. Powell. This is from 1949. This edition is from 1964. This is a time book. I don't know if you can see it, but so these are very, very fragile. These are just pages glued to a cardboard cover, and they are extremely fragile. I mean, if you bent this, it would snap. It would snap like glass. And so I'm being very careful with it. It's really good. It's about the Great Plague of Yellow Fever in Philadelphia in 1793. A lot of the main figures of the American Revolutionary War are present in this. George Washington, John Adams. It mainly focuses on Dr. Benjamin Rush, who lived in Philadelphia, who had been a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and how he saw this yellow fever going on. And basically he was the person who said there was yellow fever. Is there a picture of him in here? I don't know if I could even show you because I don't know if I could open the book wide enough without breaking it in two. I think there is, but I'm not going to risk it. I don't want to break this in two until I'm done with it. If it has to be broken, it is extremely fragile. All these books like this are very fragile. But anyway, so this is really good. I'm looking forward to finishing this one. So at that time, they didn't know that the mosquito caused yellow fever or carried yellow fever. So anyway, and the other book I'm reading, I'm just reading chapters of this here and there in between other books, and I'm not in any rush. This is Winston Churchill's Their Finest Hour. This is the second volume of his Second World War series, published in 1949, 1948, somewhere in there. And this is really good. I've only read one chapter so far, but I mean, really the Second World War series is one long book. It's split up into 6 different volumes, but it is one long book. And so I'm not rushing on that. I already know the story. I already know what happens. I already know the figures involved and that sort of thing. But I like to keep a book going where I can read it in between other books so that I never stop reading, because sometimes when I finish a book and I don't have anything else to read, I sometimes lose momentum. And that can be very dangerous and lead to several days without reading. That's what happened to me last month. So, yeah, that's pretty much it. Those are the books I've been reading. And I'd love to hear your ideas, your thoughts, your comments. And I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.